Hello guys, welcome to PeopleSoft channel. My name is Siva Koya and today I am back with one more interesting episode. In my last episode, I showed you how to configure workflow using approval workflow engine from the scratch. We applied our approval configuration on a Classic Plus page. Even though Classic Plus, under the hood, it is still a Classic page and it is not mobile friendly. Today, we are going to do something that is even more exciting. With the same approval workflow engine in the background, today I will show you how to configure a mobile-friendly fluid approval page for our transaction. Notice that I said configure, not creating an approval page. Let's talk about it. I quickly logged into PeopleSoft application just to show you PeopleSoft delivered fluid approval pages. Here I am at Employee Self-Service and this is the approval style delivered by Oracle. I'll open it. Instead of scrambling around, an approver can act upon all his approval requests from one single location that you see here. As you would have noticed, by default it would select all approval transaction types and displays in one single page. The other way to access approval transaction is by clicking on specific approval transaction type, just like I did now. After selecting a specific approval transaction, what you see here is approval transaction summary. After clicking on approval transaction summary, we can see transaction header information and then transaction line information. And finally, we can access approval chain generated by core approval workflow engine. From the transaction detail page, approver can approve or deny the transaction. Now, let's go back to the main page. You would notice the same pattern is followed for each and every approval transaction that you see here. Let's take a look at one more approval page. I will select Journal Approval page. Did you notice approval actions are displayed on top of approval transaction summary? For this specific transaction, mass approval is enabled, which means approver can select multiple journals at once and he can approve or deny them. Apart from that, the pattern is the same. Transaction summary, if I click on transaction summary, header information is displayed and then the line information. If I click on approval chain, we can see the approval path generated by AWE and I can approve or deny from transaction detail page. I hope you got my point. Behind all these approval pages, there is a template or configuration involved along with approval workflow engine. Now it's time to show you how to configure one of these mobile-friendly fluid approval pages. I'm going to configure fluid approval page for our custom transaction that we used in my previous episode. Let's go ahead and get started. Basically, we have to configure 4 different steps. Step number 1, we have to configure our core workflow setup for our transaction using approval workflow engine. We have completed this step in my previous episode. Step number 2, we have to register our transaction with the delivered fluid approval framework. Basically, we are going to hook our transaction details to summary, header, and detail sections of our fluid approval framework. Step number 3, we can pick and choose which field values should appear on our fluid approval page based on different form factors using Page Composer. And lastly, we have to associate our approval process definition with mobile approval options page. Since I have completed step number 1 in my previous episode, I will jump to step number 2. Before I go ahead and register my specific transaction with fluid approval framework, let me quickly show you my transaction page. This is the same page I was using in my previous episode. Using this page, an employee can request a stationery item at the comfort of his desk. I can select any stationery item. I will pick my employee ID. Once I submit my request, it generates the approval workflow based on our approval workflow configuration. This is the approval process we created in my previous episode. We are going to use the same approval workflow configuration for our fluid approval. In my previous episode, we used this same transaction page for approval purpose. This time, we will go fancy and create a fluid approval page using PeopleSoft delivered fluid approval framework. Let's begin that process from step number 2, as we have already completed step number 1 in my previous episode. To register my specific transaction with Fluid Approval Framework, I have to navigate to Enterprise Components, Page Composer Administrator, Developer Registration. Let's go ahead and search for an existing definition. There is only one definition available, which is our Fluid Approvals component. I'll go ahead and select it. And I'll click Search. Let's start the registration process by clicking on Add Approval Type. Notice that the entire Fluid Approval Framework is provided by one specific component that was defaulted here. You don't have to, but if you are curious to know the components of the framework, we can open this component in App Designer. The reason I came here is we have to know the page names behind our Fluid Approval Framework that are tied to summary, header, and detail sections of our Fluid Approval page. Once we know them, we have to tie our transaction data to each one of these sections through mapping that I will do now. We got our first one. This is the page that displays approval transaction summary. If we go little deep, I believe the content on approval transaction summary is displayed from level 2 section of this page. I know you might be getting nervous right now. Let me stop right here. We don't have to know the underlying logic behind this framework. All we have to know is what are the pages associated with summary, header, and detail sections that we can easily get by looking at existing configuration of other approval pages. Let me go back to our configuration page. Like I said, let's start mapping our transaction data with each one of the Fluid Approval page sections. Let's start with the summary page. Let's give a name to our approval summary page. Next, we have to map the summary page associated with the framework with our transaction summary page. Remember, we logged into App Designer and accessed the summary page. We have to provide that here. We can map our approval summary page to a specific form factor. I will select extra large form factor and let's go to the reserve field section. In order to uniquely identify our summary page, we have to associate our summary page with a page reserved field. Can we pick any object ID? No. We have to pick the object associated with the right buffer level. Initially, it might be intimidating, but if you look at existing configuration, it's easy to make out because it is pretty standard across all Fluid Approval pages. I know for summary page, the object should be from buffer level 2. I'll go ahead and select this. Down the road, this object ID will come handy for you if you want to invoke any logic specific to this page using people code. Labels looks good to me. I will navigate to keys section. This is very important. This is where we tell from which record we should display the data on our summary page. But before that, let's associate our approval process definition to our summary page by clicking on composition key fields. So let's go ahead and select our cross-reference record that we created in my previous episode, and let's select our approval process ID. Keep in mind, we are going to follow the same process for different sections of our approval page. Next, I will select application source records. This is where we specify from which record we should populate our summary page. We have a lot of flexibility here. Doesn't have to be a level 0 record. To demonstrate that, I'm going to create a custom view that is going to display employee name instead of employee ID. as well as stationary item description instead of stationary item ID. Let's go ahead and do that. Don't forget to build the view. I'm selecting the view I just created as data source for our summary page. Give some record alias. We have to specify the key field. In our case, it is rec ID. Also, don't forget to update the buffer level to 2. I hope you got some idea what I'm doing here. You can follow the same process to map header detail and line detail sections of our approval page. All you need is header detail page name and line detail page name of our underlying framework. And here are those page names. Now I'll quickly show you how to configure header detail section of our approval page. I'm not going to cover line detail section. You can try your own by following the same approach. Next, we are going to add approval action buttons on our fluid approval page. In order to add approval action buttons, we need to add a new section and we need to select the page where we want to place our approval action buttons. Let's go ahead and start configuring approval action buttons. In order to configure that, we need to add an additional section and let's name it approval action buttons. And we are going to configure that for extra large form factor. Now is the time to select the page where we want to place our approval action buttons. I will select header detail page. If you want to enable mass approval action, you need to add one more section and select the page as summary page instead of header detail page. Alright, let's continue our configuration. Now I'll specify in which order our section should be displayed when we compose our fluid page in our next step. I will select summary as sequence number 1, header detail as 2, approval action buttons as sequence number 3. Just like other sections, we have to provide page reserved field which belongs to level 0. You know the drill. Here we have to provide our AWE details. Now let's add application source records for this specific section. Here we can leverage a delivered derived work record provided by this fluid framework to enable our approval action buttons. I know what you are going to ask me. How do we know all these record and field names? I don't know the right answer, but I would encourage you to explore the existing approval setups. Now I will quickly set up our approval action fields. Here I have added 3 fields for approve, deny and pushback, and also the fluid framework also provides us the logic what should happen when user clicks on the approve button. We have a delivered code. Let me go ahead and paste the path for our approval action logic. We can pull the label for our record from a message catalog entry, and this label will be showed when we create our fluid approval page in our next step. Now we are assigning label for each of the approval action buttons, which is approve, deny and pushback. I will select the message catalog entries for the labels. That's it. I'll click done. Specifically in case of approval action buttons, we need to assign some delivered code to initialize our approval action buttons. I will go ahead and click done and save our approval page setup. Don't forget, we have to define each one of our sections for all form factors. We can easily do it using copy form factor. Even though it says copy successful, the rows are not added. So I will log out and log back in. I am back. As you can see, all my new sections are added. And this completes the lengthy step number 2. The other 2 steps are pretty straightforward and quick. Trust me on this. So far, we have composed different sections for our fluid approval page, and we have also defined the source records for each section. Now is the time to create our fluid approval page. In order to create our fluid approval page, we have to navigate to Enterprise Components, Page Composer, Page Composer. Let's search for existing definition, approvals, and I'll click on search button. And we have to select our approval definition here. I will select our approval definition, and this is where we create our fluid approval page. And here you can see 3 different sections of our fluid approval page: approval summary, header detail, and line detail. Let's go ahead and populate our approval summary. I will select toolbox. I will expand the toolbox. This is the alias name for our summary record that we associated with our summary section of our page. And these are the fields from our summary view. We can drag the name field into our approval summary section. If you changed your mind, you can always drag this field into the dustbin. This is how we remove a field from the summary section. Let me drag back the name field into approval summary because I want it. There are several ways we can arrange our fields in the approval summary section: 2 column, 3 column, based on the form factor. Let me also drag stationary item description into approval summary section. Now let's go ahead and populate header detail section of our approval page. If we expand our toolbox, we can see the records associated with this specific section. I will check show field names. Let me drag couple of fields into header detail section. Now it's time to add approval action buttons in the same header detail section. I will click on show field names. Now I will drag all my approval action buttons into header detail section. That's it guys. I will go ahead and save our fluid approval page. By the way, you can follow the same process and change your design specific to each form factor. In our case, I will keep the same design for all form factors. We are almost there guys. We have one last step pending. We have to link our approval process ID to mobile approval options page. In order to do that, we have to navigate to Enterprise Components, Approvals, Mobile Approval Options. I will navigate to Transactions tab. I will go ahead and add a new row in this grid, and I will give a sequence number. Based on the sequence number, all approval pages are displayed in order. Let's add an identifier and description for our approval process. And we need to select our approval process ID. And we need to navigate to handlers. If you want to do any special handling for mobile approvals, this is where we specify your custom handler. In our case, we are not doing any special handling. And this is where we enable our approval actions. I will enable approve, deny, and the last one would be pushback. And lastly, we can add an icon to our fluid approval page. Let me use a delivered image for this purpose. It's time for testing guys. Now I'm going to request a stationary item as a requester. I'll click add a new value and I will select my MPL ID. I will go ahead and click a keyboard request and I will submit it. Now I am logging in as approver from my real Samsung Galaxy phone. Now I will click on approval style. I will touch on the slider to open up our left hand menu and here we can see all fluid approval pages. And let me select the fluid approval page we just created, which is stationary request approval page. As you can see here, it pulled all the stationary approval requests. Let me select the stationary request we just submitted before, which is last one in the list. Just like how we configured our summary section, it displayed the complete employee name as well as stationary item description. I will go ahead and select our summary section. Now we can see the header details section. Just like how we configured, it is just showing the request ID and the employee ID. Now I will click on approval chain. Here is our approval workflow generated based on our AWE configuration. Let me close the approval chain. Now I will click on approve button to approve our transaction. It is prompting me for some comments. Let me give some comments. I clicked on submit button and we just approved our first stationary request through fluid approval page. And this concludes our episode today. That's pretty much about it for today, guys. If you like the content, don't forget to hit that like button below. And if you want more of these videos, subscribe my channel. Thank you so much for watching. See you next week. Until then, keep learning.